The chat session is being recorded. Again, feel free to chat with us or chat at me. I'll be monitoring the chat messages as I go through the slides. But other than that, I'm just going to jump right into the topic here. After today's session, we're hoping that people will be able to describe the ABCs of behavior, that you'll be able to name the functions of behavior. Those are the research-supported functions of behavior. Develop a hypothesis for a problem behavior. That's your best guess for why the behavior is occurring. And also develop an intervention plan to address the problem behavior. So that's what we're hoping to get at in the next hour or so. Now, first things first, please understand that the idea of doing a brief functional behavior assessment or understanding the principles of behavior, that's just another form of problem solving. This isn't something new or something different. It fits right inside that four-step problem solving process that the state is teaching us through multi-tiered support systems for student behavior. When you identify the problem, you look for the ABCs of behavior. So just like with academics, when you identify a problem for academics, you would be looking at things like Lexiles and benchmark scores and grade level equivalents and things like that. With ABCs of behavior, you look for something that's even more basic, I think. So what are the problem behaviors? When and where do they occur? Who is involved? Under problem analysis, you develop a function for why that problem behavior is occurring. That's just a best guess. It doesn't have to be exactly on. All we can do really with the function of behavior is provide a guess. Then in step 3, when you develop a plan, just like with your academics, you would be identifying the type of curriculum that you're going to use, the type of instructional techniques, and the type of assignments that the student would work on. When you develop a plan for behavior, you would look at what would you do to prevent the problem behavior, what you need to teach so the student doesn't need to engage in that problem behavior, and how would you reward the student so that those appropriate behaviors are more likely to occur in the future. So you can see there are some basic correlations. This is all problem solving. At the end of the day, we're identifying our plan, we're identifying how we're going to measure progress, and we're going to see how the student responds over time. So if we need to, we can change it around so the student is successful. Now before we can do that, we need to understand a few basic things about behavior, like how to define it. Behavior is always a response to a person's environment. The environment has different variables that we call antecedents. We'll go over some examples of those in just a moment. Know that behavior is anything that we say or do, so it's always observable. You want to avoid using things like wants or likes, because you can't see a want, you can't see a like. You see behaviors that lead you to conclude the student wants or likes something. So you want to focus on the behavior, not the want or the like. All behavior serves a function, which we also call the purpose of behavior, or why the student's engaging in the behavior, what are they getting out of it. Now, those basic principles are really robust and they apply to just about all kinds of behaviors. So as a result, we know that behavior is predictable. If those principles didn't apply to most behaviors, then we wouldn't have them. They wouldn't be very useful to us. So behavior is predictable. It's learned. And what that means is that you are able to teach replacement behaviors. And because it's learned, it can also be changed. So if you provide some alternative outcomes or change some of those environmental variables, you can change the problem behavior so it's no longer necessary. Now, one of the first steps in that is to define behavior in a way that everyone understands it, and that's pretty specific. And so there are a couple of tools that we use for that. We call it the dead man test. That's one tool. And then there's also the stranger test. Now, the stranger test is probably a little easier to understand. You want to describe the behavior clearly enough so that someone who has no idea what you're doing or why you're trying to observe this behavior, so that they know what to look for. So if when you write down a behavior, you can give it to someone who hasn't been involved in the situation and they understand it, they can identify it when they see it happening, then it's passed the stranger test. The dead man test is a little bit confusing. You want to make sure that your behavior definition, when you're done at the end of the day, that the behavior is not describing something that a dead man can do. So sitting quietly is something a dead man can do. So you want to avoid using that as a particular description of behavior. Let's look at a few examples of what problem behavior definitions could look like. This will probably make it a little bit more concrete. So looking at the first one there, Stephen often talks to his peers and roams around the room during independent seat work. So you could call that disruption if you wanted to. But that, talking to his peers and roaming around the room, is much more behaviorally descriptive. The next one there, Robert is routinely late to first and fourth periods. When he enters the room, he yells out, "I'm here, class can start now." So you're not saying that Robert wants to be the center of attention, you're actually describing what Robert is doing. The third example there, Caroline is a 7th grade student performing on a 5th grade level. She often swears, screams, throws things, and sometimes leaves the classroom throughout the day. So we're being very descriptive about what Caroline is doing. We're avoiding calling her like a bipolar deviant, but we're actually describing what the problem behaviors are. So then the last example there, when the teacher's talking, Cindy and Sammy turn their backs to the teacher and continue carrying on their conversation. It's loud enough for the teacher to hear from the front of the room. So you can see these are all behaviors that fall under the label of disruption or disruptive behaviors, but they're very distinct and descriptive. So since this is a chat, I'm going to give you guys a chance here. Go ahead and type into the chat pod and give us a few other examples of things you've seen in secondary schools describing a problem behavior for us. So I'm just going to pause here and give folks a chance to type into the chat pod. Give us a few other ideas. So we're looking for different examples of problem behaviors you've seen in secondary schools. All right, I thought I saw Jensen Beach starting to type something in. The room is awfully quiet. And if we need to hear, there we go. Excellent. So Jensen Beach High School, using cell phones when not allowed to do so. That's really good. It's really clear and to the point. If I see a kid using a cell phone, that's easily identifiable. A dead man also would not be using a cell phone. Good example. All right, any other ideas out there? Deanne, students are refusing to comply with a reasonable request by a staff member. Now that's a nice example because that happens a lot. Wow, and I'm not really sure where that came from. Hang on one second, guys. There we go. I'm just making the chat area a little bit bigger so everyone can see here. So Deanne, my question would be, could a dead man refuse to comply with a request? And chances are a dead man could. He could just continue sitting there. I would want to know, what are those students doing upon a request by a staff member? If you could describe what they're doing, then that would help me better understand what kinds of behaviors they're engaging in. All right, Mary, you've got a nice example there. Student calling out across the room to another student. That's observable. Dead man could not do that. I see Lori is also typing. All right, that was from Mary. Here we go. My chat box is kind of bouncing around a little bit here. And I notice that Kenneth Monette is typing. All right. Okay, well, we've got a few examples. I'm going to go ahead. Oh, here we go. Deanne, when asked to stop and tuck in their shirt, they continue to walk and do not tuck in their shirt. That's an excellent example. That is very descriptive. I can clearly see that. And that is something a dead man most certainly could not do. They're continuing to walk, and they do not tuck in their shirt. Very good. So that really does describe what's going on with those students. Those are good examples. All right, Lori. Let's see. When Lori is presented with a math assignment, she will verbally refuse and throw her paper on the floor. Excellent. So she says, "No way, Jose," and she tosses the paper to the ground. Kenneth's example, student refusing to follow the school rules with dress code. And again, Kenneth, I would try and get a little bit more descriptive with that. So students are coming to school with shirts that are too short, or shorts that are too short, or shoes that are, let's see, flip-flops, if we're not allowed to wear flip-flops. So as descriptive as you can be without getting too buried in the details. That'll help you identify exactly what you're working with, exactly what you're dealing with. Okay, so then once you understand what's going on with the problem behavior, once you can define it, you want to start looking for the ABCs of behavior. So the A's are your antecedents. Those are the event or the stimulus that occurs right before the behavior. And many times you're dealing with fast triggers, things like non-preferred activity, given a difficult task, they're told no, or they're told to tuck in their shirt and they don't. So those fast triggers, we get lots of examples of those. But there are also things called slow triggers, and those are things like being late for school, missing breakfast, missing lunch, having a fight with a peer, a fight with a parent, broke up with their girlfriend or their boyfriend, that type of a thing. Those things happen, way apart from the problem behavior many times, but they also greatly increase the likelihood of that problem behavior occurring. So many times if you have a fast trigger, and sometimes this fast trigger sets off the problem behavior and other times it doesn't, then that may mean that there's a slow trigger that's also coming into play. So maybe the students keep walking and they don't tuck in their shirt when they're told to, only on days when they're having fights with their friends and they don't want to put up with it. And for some kids, you'll see that they do that much more consistently. But at any rate, those antecedents, those come right before the behavior. And now we do have the behavior, we talked about that observable, measurable action. And then the consequences are the event or the response that immediately follows the occurrence of the behavior. So Deanne, you gave such a good example there about students refusing to comply. What they're doing is they're continuing to do what they were doing before. They continue to walk, they continue to have conversations with their peers, they're walking away from the person giving the prompt to tuck in their shirts. So that's the event or the response that immediately follows the occurrence of the behavior. So the result is they walk further away from the person who gave them the prompt. So that's what you collect. This is why you collect those particular kinds of antecedents, or those particular kinds of information. Now those antecedents events, those things that happen right before the problem behavior, antecedents increase the likelihood that the problem behavior will occur. So like I was saying with the slow triggers, if they're having a fight with their boyfriend or their girlfriend, that can increase the likelihood that they'll drop the F-bomb on the teacher when presented with a demand in the classroom. So antecedents increase the likelihood of the problem behavior. They also let you know what your prevention strategies can be. The more you can get familiar and get specific with your antecedents, the more likely you are to be able to do something to prevent that problem behavior from ever happening in the first place. Now, identifying the behavior and being really specific with the behavior, it helps you know what new skills you need to teach. Those will be your replacement behavior. The consequences, those reinforce the problem behavior, makes it more likely to happen again in the future. You can also look at consequences to determine the function or the purpose of the behavior. Why is the student doing what they're doing? Those consequences will also help you figure out what those alternative appropriate reinforcers will be for showing the new skills that you identified, for identifying those behaviors you want to see. So the consequences, they have a lot to do with shaping behavior, but the antecedents also come into role. You can prevent problem behavior from occurring. Okay, so let's start with some examples of antecedents. Again, this goes back to some things going on with disruption. So one example of an antecedent is the teacher tells a student to get into their cooperative learning groups. Another example, Sarah was asked to stop talking, or students are told to start on problems 1 through 25 on page 50 of their math text. The teacher calls on James to answer a question in front of the class, or Patrick was late to class and the teacher asked him why and asked him for a pass. Students are told to transition to the lab tables, or Tammy was told to move seats. So now you guys gave me some good examples of behavior before, and a couple of them also included some antecedents. Like with Deanne's example, your antecedent was the student was asked to stop and tuck in their shirt. So that's an antecedent, and the behavior is they continue to walk. Lori, in your example, you also gave an antecedent. When Lori's presented with a math assignment, that was your antecedent. Let's see. How about Jensen Beach and Kenneth? Can you guys come up with a couple examples of different antecedents that you've seen in secondary schools? And I don't want to just pick on you guys and single you guys out. Anyone who's joined us for today's chat here, please feel free to jump in and give a couple examples or one example of different antecedents you see at the secondary level. And I'll give you a moment here just to sit back and maybe think of an example. All All right, I notice Gay is typing. Welcome if you're just joining us. We've just gotten into the material here. Excellent. So Deanne, very good. Student was asked to slow down in the hallway. I'm getting the sense, Deanne, that there's a lot of problem behaviors occurring in the hallways. And that's absolutely the case in many schools. So that's a good antecedent, is the student was asked to slow down in the hallway. Another antecedent for secondary level, maybe the warning bell rings to let students know, hey, class is about ready to begin. Gay is telling us students who have outside issues and when asked to do a task, they become aggressive and they use profane words. Absolutely. So Gay, you're identifying that slow trigger. Something's going on, kind of removed in time, but their bucket's full, and when you ask them to do one thing, then that becomes an antecedent for problem behavior. Excellent, Ellen. That's a good one. Students is told to go to the end of the lunch line after they push someone. Very good. And Kenneth is going to jump in the fray here. And actually, Ellen, I might imagine another kind of antecedent that you might see in that situation. Maybe the antecedent is that students are standing very close to one another and you don't really have a very straight or cohesive line. That might be an antecedent for the pushing behavior in the first place. All right, Lori's typing in transitions from classroom to classroom in a large school. Now, Lori, I would look at trying to be even more specific with that. What is it about the transitions? Is it when that bell rings? Is it when the hallways are crowded? You guys are doing great. I love seeing all the people typing in. And I'm just being quiet on my side here. I can notice people are typing. All right, Kenneth, the student was asked to stop running after the peers in the hallway. That's great. You see the student running, and so you ask the student to stop running. That might be an antecedent for another behavior. Jensen Beach High, student will get into a fight pulling each other's hair following a previous argument between students. So it's occurring in the hallway during transition to the next class. All right, so the antecedent there might be multiple students are in the hallway together that happen to have been in a conflict earlier in the day. That's an antecedent. Lori, and you were clarifying there, thank you, when the bell rings. Absolutely. So you guys have the general idea. That's good. You want to identify the variables that are in place right before the problem behavior occurs. And you can get more specific if you want to by looking for some of those slow triggers. But you know, especially if you're just starting to get into identifying the different kinds of behavior, just being specific about what's going on immediately before the problem behavior, that'll help you out down the road when you're trying to determine what all is going on. Okay, so those are all antecedents. So then examples of behavior. Now we had a few examples before. We have a few more here that are specific to the secondary level. You might hear students mumbling, "I ain't moving," put their head down on the desk and pull the hoodie up over their head. Another example of behavior, this one is an appropriate behavior. Sarah says, "Sorry," and stops talking. It's a good thing I don't have a lisp today. So Sarah says she's sorry and stops talking. Another example of a behavior, student says, "I hate math, bump this," and slams the book closed and throws it onto the floor. Another example, James starts to tell a knock-knock joke. Patrick says his second period teacher was talking to him and would not let him leave. He says he does not have a pass. Other behaviors, students pick up their supplies and quietly and quickly move to the lab tables at the back of the room. That's an appropriate behavior. And then the last example, Tammy screams at the teacher, "Why are you always picking on me? You never tell anyone else to move. Tell Peter to move." All right, so those are very descriptive. When you can nail those down that specifically, then you can start to identify the skills that you want to see instead. So it comes in handy to get practice in defining both inappropriate, those problem behaviors, as well as appropriate behaviors. So if you're defining appropriate behaviors just by, I want them to follow the rules, you'll actually need to get a little bit more specific than that in order to develop an effective intervention. So finally here, examples of consequences. The teacher walks away and lets the student sleep. Another example, the teacher tells Sarah she appreciates her being respectful. The teacher tells the student to gather his belongings, hands him a referral, and tells him to go to the principal's office. Other examples of consequences: the teacher says who, finishes the joke, and then asks the student to answer the question. And then the student will answer the question. So these are things, again, that are occurring right after the problem behavior or right after the appropriate behavior. So that really is key. These aren't separated in time. These are very close together, and they're also very descriptive, so you can see exactly what's going on with these particular scenarios. Now, if you're playing along at home and you've downloaded the PowerPoint presentation from our file share pod, you might notice that the antecedents, behaviors, and consequences, they all line up together. And that's actually what we're going to do next. So I'm just going to jump ahead just a little bit so it's nice and concrete here. So the ABCs of behavior, when you put them all together, this is what you get. So from our problem behavior example for disruption, Stephen also often talks to his peers and roams around the room during independent seat work. So the antecedent in that example is that the teacher assigns independent work to the class after providing direct instruction, and then the teacher begins working at her desk. The behavior that we're seeing, Stephen talking to his peers while he's roaming around the room. What happens immediately after that? The teacher remains at her desk and repeatedly redirects Stephen to return to his seat and complete his work. I noticed that Paula jumped in here. Sometimes students are engaging in illegal substance or drugs that impact their behavior and mood in class. Sure, that's absolutely a possibility, and I would put that as a slow trigger for particular variables. So when a student is engaging in those types of activities, they act as a setting event, or they make it more likely that certain immediate antecedents will trigger a problem behavior. Absolutely, Paula, that's a good catch. And that really is seen much more in secondary schools than in elementary schools. Okay, so when you put those ABCs together, then you can start to get a sense of why that problem behavior is occurring. And the reason why that behavior is occurring will always boil down to one of these 6 things. So I'm going to break out the pointer here. There we go. So the research-based functions of behaviors are to either get or get away from attention, tangibles or activities, or sensory stimulation. So when you're making your hypothesis about why a behavior is occurring, you want to break it down and try to understand it in these very, very basic terms. One thing that we see frequently when schools do brief functions of behavior or brief assessments of behavior is that they'll say a student's doing something because he wants to have control. And control is actually kind of a middle variable. You haven't really broken it down quite enough. I would push you guys to further try to explore what is the student getting when he has control. If he has control of the class, he's probably getting attention. He might also be getting activities. And who knows, maybe he's taking control of the thermostat or the light switch, and he's getting some sensory stimulation out of that. Now, Kenneth, I notice you have your hand raised. If you have a question, feel free to type it into the chat pod. I'm keeping an eye on that as we go through the chat today. All right. Okay, there we go. So, Kenneth, if you do have a question, please feel free to type it into chat. So we're just talking about the functions of behavior, and these are the research-based or research-supported functions of behavior, whether it's appropriate behavior or inappropriate behavior. All right, so then determining the function of behavior. Why is that problem behavior occurring? It's always occurring to either get or escape attention, tangibles, or sensories. When you're stating the function of the behavior, you want to develop your hypothesis. And if you follow the structured format, that'll kind of help you make sure you're identifying everything you need to identify and that it's all tying together and making sense. So when blank occurs, so when that antecedent occurs, the student engages in whatever that behavior may be. As a result, she or he is able to get or get away from one of those few basic things. Okay, so let's break this into an example a little bit more clearly. So the functions of behavior, we go back to our example of Stephen walking around the room and talking to his peers during independent seat work. So during problem analysis, you ask, why is this occurring? Well, maybe the work is too hard for Stephen to do by himself. So when he gets up and he talks to his peers and he's walking around the room, he gets to avoid the task. You might also have a guess that Stephen needs additional assistance in order to complete the assignment. So he would be getting attention and avoiding the task. So he might be doing two things at once. There could be two competing functions of that problem behavior. Another guess, maybe Stephen would rather talk to his friends, so he gets peer attention out of the walking and roaming around the room. Now you guys, go ahead and type into the chat pod, why else might Stephen be roaming around the room during independent seat work? What are some guesses that you guys have? All right, I notice a couple of people are typing. We'll hang out here, let you guys type. So they're avoiding work that's too difficult for them, absolutely. So they're getting away from something, they're getting away from an activity. Very good. Inability to sit and stay focused for long periods of time. All right, Deanne, that's a really good thing to add to the conversation here. So maybe they're getting up and roaming around the room because they're not able to sit and stay focused for those long periods of time. I would actually put those into an antecedent category. Maybe that's like a slow trigger. So they have a very short attention span, and so when presented with X, then they do Y as a result. In which case, then you might say that they're escaping that feeling, whatever it is it may be, that sensory feeling, when they can't pay attention anymore, but they're still being asked to. So they might be escaping a sensory that way. That's a great example to throw into the mix. So Gay is saying many students who have been labeled with ADHD or ADD will tend to do other things when they can't sit. Absolutely. Yeah, and Gay, you identified that's exactly what Deanne was saying. Absolutely. So then there's a sensory thing where at some point it becomes very hard to sit and focus and continue sitting and doing one type of thing. So they're escaping that sensory experience that they feel when you're placing demands on them that they're not able to meet. All right, Florida School for the Deaf and Blind, too many questions on the paper, so they might feel overwhelmed by the assignment. So they're escaping the assignment. Very good. All right, Kenneth, sometimes students don't want their peers to know they are smart. And excellent. So then the function of behavior I would assign to that is that they're avoiding peer attention. So if they were to sit in their desk and complete the assignment, their peers would see them and they would tease them because, oh, he's a smart kid, he's playing by so-and-so's rules. So yeah, I would say that the function of the behavior in that particular instance is that they're avoiding negative peer attention. Jensen Beach High School, that's a great example. They're sleepy, they need to move around to wake up. So then the function of that, you'd say that they're escaping the feeling of sleepiness. Okay, Gay's throwing out there may also be too many stimuli in the room. So that one I'd want to look and see what evidence do you have to support that there may be too many stimuli. What are they getting by getting up and roaming around the room, and what are they avoiding? Or what would they be avoiding by getting up and moving around the room? These are great examples. The thing about the functional behavior is that when you first sit down to try and identify it, you're only providing a guess. So when you put it down on paper, this is a starting point, and you want to use whatever data you have about the student or the situation to try and identify the most likely reason. All right, Kenneth, thank you for that additional example there. Peer pressure to fit in or to gain attention from peers. Absolutely. You guys got it. Those are great examples. I'm going to keep you guys working here. I hope no one's too sleepy from lunch because there's more work coming up here. So we had a number of different examples that we provided before, and so we're kind of continuing along with those examples. I'm going to get you guys to take another guess at the function of the behavior. So in the first example here, we've done this one for you. The antecedent is that the teacher tells the student to get into their cooperative learning groups. The behavior is the student mumbles, "I ain't moving," puts his head down on his desk, and pulls his hoodie up over his head. The consequence, or what happens immediately after that, is that the teacher walks away and lets the student sleep. So the function of that behavior, it says avoid peer attention. I would actually caution and go out on a limb and say the student's avoiding the activity. So he has the behavior, "I ain't moving," puts his hoodie on, and the teacher walks away and lets the student sleep. So he's avoiding the activity, or maybe he's getting access to the sensory of going to sleep. Let's try the next example. This one's going to be on you guys. The antecedent, Sarah was asked to stop talking. The behavior, student says sorry and stops talking. And then what happens immediately after? The teacher tells Sarah she appreciates her being respectful. So this is an example of a good behavior, an appropriate behavior that we want to see more of. My question to you guys is, what's the function of Sarah saying sorry and stop talking? What's the function of that behavior? What is Sarah getting out of saying she's sorry and stopping her conversation? Go ahead and type it into the chat if you have a guess. All right, got a couple people who are working hard today. Gay and Tanisha. So why is Sarah saying she's sorry and stopping her conversation? To get attention from the teacher. Excellent. Way to go, Lori. I didn't even know you were typing out there. That's exactly right. She's saying she's sorry and she's stopping talking, and as a result, she gets positive attention from the teacher. Absolutely. So she's wanting that teacher's acceptance. So the thing that she's getting out of that is appropriate adult attention, or positive adult attention. Excellent. Very good. So you guys got it. So she's getting attention by saying she's sorry and she stops talking. You might also say that she's avoiding negative adult attention. She's avoiding the tirade that will follow if she continues to talk with her friend after the teacher asked her to stop. So you could say either one of those things. You just want to look at that behavior a number of times over a period of time to get a better sense of why she might be doing it. I'm going to move on to the last example on the slide here. Students are told to start on problems 1 through 25 on page 50 of their math book. The student says, "I hate math, bump this," slams the book closed, and throws it onto the floor. Then the consequence, the thing that happens immediately after that, is the teacher tells the student to gather his belongings, hands him a referral, and tells him to go down to the principal's office. So what's the function of the student saying, "I hate math, bump this," and throwing his book to the floor? What is the student getting out of it? Mary, excellent. Avoiding work, avoidance to the task. You guys got it. He gets out of it. You guys absolutely got it. You must have been through the PBIS Tier 1 training. Very good. So that's right. So the function here is that the student is getting out of the task. And then do you guys think that he would be more likely to show that behavior in the future or less likely? More likely, absolutely. If he really is doing it to get out of the task and he gets an office referral and gets sent down the office, then that just paid off for him. He's getting out of the task. Way to go, guys. You got it. You got it. And just when you thought you were done with the slide, we have more examples. All right, let's look at that first one. Teacher calls on James to answer a question in front of the class. The behavior is James starts to tell a knock-knock joke. The teacher, what happens immediately after? The teacher says, "Who?" and finishes the joke and then asks the student to answer the question. And then the student really does answer the question. So why do we think James starts to tell a knock-knock joke when the teacher asks him to answer a question? To gain attention. You guys got it. That's great. Excellent. You guys got it. To get attention. He gets attention from the teacher and from his peers. That's right. And then would he be more or less likely to tell a knock-knock joke again in the future? More, yeah, absolutely, because he's getting more attention. Absolutely, that could be it. Now, if someone said, well, I think that James is doing this to escape the activity because he's like avoiding answering the question, well, then he also kind of got to avoid it for a very short time. In the end, he ultimately had to answer the question. And again, you can't really tell for sure. You're just making a best guess based on what you know about the situation. Good job, guys. All right, let's look at Patrick, the antecedent. Patrick was late to class, and the teacher asked him why and for a pass. The behavior. Patrick says his second period teacher was talking to him and wouldn't let him leave. He says he does not have a pass. So the consequence for that, immediately the teacher sends Patrick out of the room to get a pass from his second period teacher. So regardless of whether or not that behavior, Patrick's verbal statements, whether or not that was true, what is the possible function of Patrick saying those things? Yep, he's avoiding work. That's right. That's right. So that behavior, telling the teacher that he was talking to his teacher before and he doesn't have a pass, that behavior gets him out of class. He gets to avoid work. Very good. All right, we're going to hit the last one here. Florida School for the Deaf and Blind. Do you think that sometimes you have to pick and choose what you will address with a student? Absolutely. You got to pick your battles. So particularly doing these brief assessments of the function of behavior, this comes in handy when a student has a persistent problem. So this might be a behavior that has occurred a few times in a short time period, something that you sense is going to be problematic with the student. This is a great time to start collecting information. You might use a minor form to collect information about what's going on right before, what that behavior is, and then what happens immediately after. And then for those ongoing or those persistent low-key problems, you can collect the data you need to make a good identification of the function of the problem behavior, and you'll be able to change it so it doesn't escalate or grow out of control. Jensen Beach, you do need to be consistent, though. That's right. That's one of the big principles that we're going to cover right at the end of the session, is that consistency, modeling, those things are key for students to learn. Students learn by seeing what happens with students, with other students, as well as what happens to them. So that's through that modeling effect. Okay, so then that last point there, the last antecedent, students are told to transition to lab tables. The behavior, students pick up their supplies and quietly and quickly move to the lab tables at the back of the room. So that's an appropriate behavior we like seeing. What happens immediately after that? The teacher tells the class they beat last week's record by 5 seconds and thanks them for being responsible. So what's the function of the students picking up their supplies and quietly and quickly moving to the lab tables at the back of the room? Attention and praise from the teacher. Excellent. Positive teacher attention. You guys got it. Excellent. Thank you. You guys are being very reinforcing for me. I appreciate your comments. Excellent. Okay, so then we had one last one here about Tammy moving seats, and then Tammy screams at the teacher, "Why are you always picking on me? You never tell anyone else to move. Tell Peter to move." The consequence there, the teacher in a calm voice asks Tammy to move again and walks away. The teacher repeats this 2 more times, and then Tammy moves. So this one's kind of tricky. What might be going on? What's the function of Tammy's behavior about screaming back at the teacher and telling her to make somebody else move? What is Tammy getting out of that? Trying to redirect the teacher's attention elsewhere. Yeah, avoid the move, absolutely. So if we look at what happens right after the behavior, the teacher states in a calm voice, "Please move," and then walks away. So the teacher has to do it a couple more times, and then Tammy moves. So she does gain attention from the teacher by doing that. But she also gets to avoid whatever that task or activity is for a little bit longer. She may have learned that the teacher has a certain number of times, if she can push it 2 times, and then she won't get into too much trouble. Okay, I'm noticing a comment here from Florida School for the Deaf and Blind. Maybe she's already previously upset from another incident, and she takes it out on the teacher by screaming. That would be an example of an antecedent. That would be one of those slow triggers that makes the problem behavior more likely to occur. So then the function of the behavior, again, is probably avoiding that move, avoiding the activity, possibly some attention from the teacher, but it looks like the teacher responds, but it's not like the teacher is getting all out of control or giving this a great deal of energy. So I would probably get on board with avoiding the task for this particular function. Again, it is a guess. We can make as many guesses as we need to help identify the problem. Okay, so then, what do we do about it? Once we have a decent guess about why the student might be engaging in that behavior, then we can use the antecedents, the behavior, and the consequences to develop a plan to change the behavior. So in our case, going back to Stephen with his disruption where he gets up, he roams around the room instead of working on his seat work. We think that he's getting teacher and peer attention and he's escaping the task. So in this example, the antecedents for Stephen is that he's given independent seat work and then the teacher goes to her desk to work on her own computer. So if we change either one of these antecedents, then we may be able to prevent the problem behavior from occurring. So some prevention strategies. Maybe after assigning the independent seat work, the teacher immediately goes to review the assignment individually with Stephen to make sure that he understands what to do. So we're actually we're getting a couple birds with one stone there. The student is getting attention from the teacher, which is one of the things we think that he's getting from that problem behavior. So we're giving him a better way to get attention. We're also addressing the possibility that, well, maybe he doesn't understand what's being asked of him. So now we're providing a way for him to ask questions and make sure he can complete the task we're asking him to do. So that's one possible strategy. Another strategy, Stephen will be offered the choice of completing the assignment at his desk or at the front table near the teacher's desk. So if he's really getting up and wandering to get attention, we're giving him a better way of getting attention where he can still sit down and do his work. Another strategy, Stephen will be offered the choice of completing the assignment alone or with his study buddy at the front table. So again, if we think it was peer attention that he was getting out of that problem behavior, we've just identified a way that he can get the peer attention and still get his assignment done. Do you guys have other prevention strategies that you might try with Stephen? Things that would address either one of these antecedents. The fact that he's given independent seat work, can you change something about that? Or can you change something about how the teacher behaves so that you prevent the problem behavior of roaming the room? Notice we've got one participant typing. Couple. Way to go, guys. You've had great participation today. So what can you change about the antecedents to prevent the problem behavior from occurring? Excellent. So Lori, that's a great antecedent strategy. The teacher can move around the room to check on all students and offer assistance. Fantastic. Kenneth, great. Another great example there. Use a paraprofessional to work one-on-one with Stephen. Absolutely. And Gabe, that's pretty much the same idea there. If there's another adult in the room, they might be able to stand near the student so they can give us assistance as soon as the task is given. Absolutely. So in all those examples, you guys did a really good job of identifying something that you can change in advance to prevent that problem behavior from occurring. Nice job with that. Now here, teaching, there's another component of intervening with behavior. You've got the current behavior. Stephen talks to his peers and roams around the room. What we want to see instead is that Stephen will remain in his designated area and complete his assignment. So it's not just Stephen will do what he's told. We're explaining remaining in his designated area and completing his assignment. So then the question to ask is, what skills do you need to teach Stephen so that he's able to do this? What skills do you need to teach him so he can show the replacement behavior? Well, you can give him a checklist for starters, and the checklist will outline the expected behaviors during independent seat work time, and you're going to match those back to the school-wide expectation of be responsible. So the student has a way of generalizing that strategy and also generalizing what he's already learned about being responsible. The checklist will include a prompt to ask his study buddy for help prior to seeking the teacher's assistance. So maybe this is a situation where the teacher doesn't have a lot of help in her room. She has a lot of students with questions, and so one of the steps we need to teach Stephen is to go to a designated person to get help before wandering around the room to track down the teacher. And then what we're teaching Stephen is how to use that checklist to monitor his own behavior. So do you guys have other ideas of what skills you might need to teach Stephen so that he can demonstrate this replacement behavior? I know this was a head scratcher. I thought that using the checklist was a great idea. And self-monitoring is one of those intervention strategies that has a nice amount of research to support it. So self-monitoring is a really nice intervention. Okay, for the sake of time, I'll go ahead and scooch on to the next slide. All right, so another component of that plan development is figuring out how to reinforce the appropriate behavior when you see it happening. So we have that same appropriate behavior that we want to see and the consequences to increase the likelihood that it will occur. So the new consequences. The teacher will review the checklist with Stephen at the end of the independent work period. So he's getting attention, which is something that we think Stephen wants more of. So he's getting attention for showing the appropriate replacement behavior. We can also teach Stephen, we can also teach him how to put a check mark down for each task that he's able to successfully complete. And then after he gets a certain number of checks, he'll be able to opt out of 2 of the questions on an independent task of his choice. So this might take him some time to earn, but then we're also meeting the possible function of escaping or avoiding the task on the independent seat work. So these are a couple different ways of reinforcing the appropriate behavior, and while we're reinforcing the appropriate behavior, we're doing it in a way that also gets him what he was needing, whether it was attention or escaping the task that was probably pretty difficult for him. All right, Jensen Beach High School, I noticed that you added in here. The teacher may also prep another student to assist Stephen and award that student. Absolutely. So then you're teaching students to rely on each other in appropriate ways. I love that. Okay. Other ideas for reinforcement strategies, ways of reinforcing this replacement behavior? All right, we do have another idea. Positive notes home in the agenda book. Absolutely. So that might get Stephen some positive attention from his parents. So if he's motivated by attention, that might be another way for him to get attention. I know there's a couple more people have some other ideas. Give you a chance to get those down. Okay, so Lori says, what if the function of his behavior was to gain social time? Maybe offering a few minutes at the end of class for the students to socialize. Absolutely, that's a great strategy. So if we see the appropriate behavior, then he will get some free time without getting into trouble to talk with his peers, so he can get that peer attention in an appropriate way. Okay, that's a nice point. In secondary schools, you might be lucky enough to have a TA in your class, and they can help with the student. That's true in elementary, too, but absolutely. So they could get some extra attention that way. Positive notes home. Could add a reward that relates to the school-wide incentives? Absolutely, you could, Deanne. That's why we have the Tier 1 system in place in our schools, is to give teachers more tools to work with. So if you do already have something in place, then you can do something with an individual student that builds on that current system. Absolutely. I would just go ahead and kind of emphasize still that even if you've got this Tier 1 system in place, if your intervention is going to be effective, then you have to tie into the Tier 1 system in a way that meets the function of the behavior. So if the student wants to get peer attention and the school-wide incentive is tokens for a store, then you're probably not going to have as effective of an intervention as you would if the school-wide incentive had to do with getting peer attention, which is what the function of that problem behavior really could be. Okay, So Kenneth, I'm going to let you keep on typing. Okay, so plan development. Another principle to keep in mind is that consequences are most effective when consistently and immediately are given upon display of the appropriate behavior. And that's what Jensen Beach High School was saying earlier in the session here today, is that consistency is key. So immediacy and consistency will really help you have an impact on the student's behavior. Now remember, Kenneth, I see here, uses of check-in, check-out. That's a great way for students to get attention. If they're motivated by getting adult attention, positive adult attention, check-in, check-out is a fantastic way for them to get it in a real structured and systematic way. It also lets you get information for progress monitoring, so you can see, are they making progress, or do you need to do something different? Okay, so this is going back to those principles that we talked about right at the beginning of the presentation today. Remember that behavior is learned, that it can be changed, and new behavior can be taught. It seems real basic, but a lot of folks get, I think, probably exasperated by behavior, and they tend to give up early, or they might write the student off as just being a bad egg. But the key is to use the behavior principles so that you can determine the replacement behavior, figure out what needs to be taught so the student can display the appropriate behavior, and teach, model, and prompt what you want to see. So in summary, big ideas to take away from today is that consequences will strengthen and weaken behavior. So in order to do that, you want to reward students' use of demonstration of new appropriate skills and behaviors immediately, as often as possible, which should be all the time, is tied back to the school-wide expectation that the student's demonstrating. Because if they're learning what those school-wide expectations mean all throughout the school, and then you're using those expectations when you're dealing with a specific problem behavior for a student, then they're going to apply what they've learned from other parts of the school to their own specific situation, and vice versa. So you're just getting more bang for your buck that way. Positive praise is always helpful. Using the school-wide reward system. You also want to keep an eye on how things were set up to begin with. So those naturally occurring consequences, as much as you can, you want to change those around so that inappropriate behavior is no longer being reinforced. So instead of sending the student out of the room to get a pass from a previous teacher, the student owes you 3 minutes of time for having come late to class. Or maybe when a student is missing their bell work, they have to complete that bell work before they get to use the computer. So they're no longer avoiding those things that they're trying to get out of. They actually owe them back to you. So they're no longer being reinforced for inappropriate behavior. All right. Know that, big picture, behavior tends to be repeated due to the consequences that follow the behavior. So this is true for appropriate behavior. When something desirable follows an appropriate or an inappropriate behavior, the behavior is more likely to be repeated. So you guys were hitting on this before with our different examples. Students are being sent out of the office for inappropriate behavior, which allows them to avoid whatever thing they were trying to avoid. That problem behavior is more likely to be repeated. Also know behavior is weakened by withholding consequences that maintain it. So when something desirable does not follow an appropriate or an inappropriate behavior, the behavior is less likely to be repeated. So, for example, let's see, something desirable. Christina's no longer put in the hallway when she acts up. She has to complete missing work during club time, and as a result, she's now completing her assignments. So before she was doing something inappropriate, she was being sent out. We're no longer sending her out. We're making her stay in class. So she's less likely to act out. With Victor, he loves to talk and be the first person to raise his hand in class. The teacher stops calling on him, so now he's yelling out his answers. So he was displaying an appropriate behavior of raising his hand during instruction, and when that was no longer working, he's just going to go back and start yelling out his answers so that he gets the attention that he's been seeking. Okay, and I know we're running short on time, so a couple of last ideas. Behavior is strengthened, weakened, or maintained through modeling by peers and adults. So some examples of this. This is why we have a school-wide system in place. Stephen may be less likely to leave his assigned area when he sees his peers earning tiger paws for remaining seated and working quietly on the assignment. So he sees that he can get something he wants by displaying a certain behavior because he sees other kids earning it for their behaviors. Stephen may be more likely to complete the task when he sees his peers earning free time for completing the assignment. And Stephen may continue to talk to his peers and roam around the room during independent seat work if he sees that his peers are doing the same type of behaviors. So in that case, seeing what other kids are doing or maintaining what Stephen is doing. So those basic principles of behavior, they are really important for your school-wide Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports. It provides a common framework for addressing problem behaviors across the tiers. So you guys might see how a situation where a student is displaying persistent levels of behavior, you use those tracking forms at Tier 1. If the problem continues to grow, then you can use the supports at Tier 2 to provide more intensive support for the student. And if needed, you can also continue supports up through Tier 3 before you can impact the student. So it goes from Tier 1 to Tier 3 and back down again. Using those basic principles will also lead you to greater consistency when you're implementing RTI for behavior. All right, so a real quick plug. Our next online chat is Teaching Social and Emotional Behavior. That's going to happen on Wednesday, October 24th at 2:30 Eastern Time, 1:30 for folks up in the Panhandle. And our contact information is here on the slide. So I'm going to hang out for another moment or two. It is 3:01. Thank you guys for joining us today. If you don't mind, I'm going to put up